In a small corner of the galaxy, a race of aliens, once proud and powerful, now faced their end. Their world, once a place of beauty, was now burning. Tall cities, filled with the hopes and dreams of their people, were crumbling to ash. The sound of explosions echoed through the streets, mixing with the cries of those who tried to flee. The invaders had come with no warning, no mercy. They were relentless, destroying everything in their path. The alien race had fought back, but their weapons were no match for the sheer power of the invaders. The last of their forces were scattered, and with their final breaths, they sent out a desperate message, an SOS, hoping that someone, anyone, would hear it. The signal was weak, crackling as it traveled across the vast emptiness of space. The message was simple, a cry for help: we are dying. Our cities burn. Our people are falling. Please, anyone, help us. There was no grandeur, no hope left in their voice, only fear and desperation. It was a last-ditch effort, a plea to the stars, to the unknown. But in the cold void of space, there was no response. The universe seemed silent, as if it didn't care about the fate of this small, broken species. The aliens waited, their eyes turned to the sky, hoping for a miracle, but receiving none. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and yet no one came. The nights were the worst. The constant sound of distant battles, the flashes of fire on the horizon, and the silence that followed each explosion were maddening. The survivors huddled together, holding on to the last remnants of their hope, but they knew in their hearts that hope was quickly fading. They had called out to the universe, but it had turned its back on them. Days turned into weeks, and still, no help came. Their planet, their home, was slowly being erased from existence. But then, far across the galaxy, something stirred. A signal, faint but clear, reached the far corners of space. It wasn't a response to the aliens' SOS. Not yet. It was a message from humanity, from the Deathworlders, the most dangerous species in the galaxy. The fleet had been called, not by the aliens, but by the strange forces of fate. Humanity had been watching, aware of the alien struggle, and now they were making their move. The Deathworlder fleet, vast and powerful, began to mobilize. Ships the size of mountains, filled with warriors who had never known defeat, prepared for the long journey across the stars. Their engines roared to life, and the cold emptiness of space seemed to shrink as the fleet surged forward. The Deathworlders did not come with kindness. They did not come with peace. They came with power, and they would not be swayed by any plea for mercy. The fleet moved toward the alien world, each ship brimming with weapons, each soldier filled with the purpose of their mission, to restore order through strength. The aliens, still in the dark, continued their struggle. They fought to hold on to their cities, their homes, but the invaders were unstoppable. Each day, the walls around them grew tighter, the enemy closing in from all sides. Yet, still, they did not know that their fate was being decided elsewhere. The Deathworlders were coming, and they would not stop until they had claimed victory. As the fleet drew closer, the tension among the survivors grew. They knew their time was running out. They had sent out the SOS, but the universe had not answered. The Deathworlders, the powerful species they had unknowingly called upon, were on their way, and the aliens had no idea what to expect. They were too small, too weak to stand against such an unstoppable force. They had hoped for a savior, but they were about to meet their true conquerors. The first sign of the Deathworlders' arrival came with the appearance of their massive ships in the sky. The invaders had not noticed the fleet at first, too focused on their destruction of the alien cities. But now, they looked up, and for the first time, fear washed over them. These were no ordinary ships. They were warships, vast and imposing, bristling with weapons that could level entire cities with a single blast. The sky darkened as they descended, blotting out the stars with their sheer size. The invaders paused, confused, unsure of what they were seeing. They had been the ones to bring destruction to this world, but now they were faced with something far more terrifying. The Deathworlders were here, and they did not come to negotiate. They came to dominate. The aliens watched in stunned silence as the ships continued their descent. The hum of the engines, the light from the weapons charging, all of it sent a chill down their spines. They had been fighting for their lives, but now they were caught between two unstoppable forces. On one side, the invaders, ruthless and relentless. On the other, the Deathwelders, a species of unmatched power, who would show no mercy. The first shots fired from the Deathwelder fleet were deafening. Their weapons rained down from the sky, smashing into the invader forces with overwhelming force. The ground shook with every blast, and the aliens watched in awe and fear as the enemy forces were torn apart. The Deathwelders moved like a storm, unstoppable and deadly. Their ships hovered above the battlefield, raining destruction on anything that moved. The invaders tried to fight back, but their weapons were nothing compared to the might of the Deathwelders. The aliens could only watch as their planet was reshaped by the power of the Deathwelder fleet. The invaders were no match for them, and the aliens knew it. They had begged for help, but they had not expected this. The Deathwelders did not come to heal, to save, or to negotiate. They came to end the war, and they did so with terrifying precision. The aliens were left in awe of the destruction, their hopes now mixed with fear. The SOS they had sent had reached the most dangerous species in the galaxy, and it had answered with power, not mercy. As the Deathwelder fleet continued its assault, the aliens realized the full extent of what had happened. They had called for help, but in doing so, they had invited the storm. They had asked for mercy, but the answer had come in the form of an iron fist. And as the last of the invader forces fell, the aliens understood that their world had changed forever. The Deathwelders had arrived, and there would be no going back as the Deathwelder fleet descended upon the alien planet. The sky was no longer just a backdrop of stars, but a darkened ocean filled with massive ships. Their sheer size was enough to cast shadows over entire cities, and their weapons hummed with deadly intent. The alien survivors watched from their shelters, eyes wide with a mix of awe and terror. The fleet was not just here to fight the invaders. They were here to reshape the world. The ground shook beneath their feet as the first shots rang out from the human ships. The invaders had no time to react. The sheer power of the Deathwelder technology overwhelmed them, tearing through their defenses in seconds. Buildings crumbled, streets were torn apart, and the invaders' forces were scattered before they could even organize a counterattack. It was swift, efficient, and terrifying to watch. The invaders, who had once seemed unstoppable, were now running in panic, their once proud machines falling to the relentless might of the human fleet. The aliens, huddled in their shelters, listened to the deafening blasts and felt the vibrations in their bones. They had prayed for help, but what had come was beyond anything they had imagined. The humans didn't arrive with peacekeepers or healers. They arrived with the force of an unstoppable storm. The message they sent was clear. Power is the only thing that matters in this universe. There was no room for weakness, no place for mercy. The surviving aliens tried to understand what was happening. Their homes were being destroyed, their enemies were being obliterated, but in the midst of this chaos, something inside them stirred. A bitter truth began to settle in their hearts. They had called for help, but they had unknowingly invited something much darker. The Deathwelders were not here to offer aid. They were here to take control. Up above, the massive warships moved with precision, hovering just above the ruins, raining fire down upon the invaders' last defenses. Soldiers in armored suits began to descend from the ships, their movements swift and efficient. There was no mercy in their actions, no hesitation in their eyes. The aliens watched in stunned silence as the invaders were eradicated, not by overwhelming numbers, but by overwhelming power. The humans did not fight like the aliens. They fought with an unmatched coldness, a ruthless precision that left no room for error. As the human forces pushed forward, securing the planet, the aliens began to realize the full extent of their situation. The invaders, though merciless, had at least understood the concept of negotiation. The Deathwelders didn't care about negotiation. They cared only about domination. They cared about showing their superiority, and they did it in the most brutal way possible. The last of the invaders fell under the relentless assault of the Deathwelder fleet. Their machines lay in ruins, their forces scattered to the wind, and the planet was left in a state of utter destruction. But amidst this devastation, The alien survivors were left with one lingering question. What would happen next? The invaders were gone, but the Deathworlders remained. The humans, having claimed the planet, began to establish their own order. Their ships loomed in the sky like unyielding mountains of metal, and their soldiers began to move through the cities, securing the population. The alien survivors, still shaken by the violence they had witnessed, had no choice but to comply. Their world had been destroyed, and now, it seemed, their future would be shaped by the very species they had begged for help. As the humans began to take control, the survivors couldn't help but wonder if they had made a mistake. Had they truly called for help, or had they simply invited their own doom? The Deathworlders had come, and they had brought with them an army that would now decide the fate of the alien race. The aliens had no choice but to submit, to live under the shadow of the Deathworlder fleet, their lives no longer their own. In the days that followed, the planet fell into a strange silence. The battle was over, but the real war had only just begun. The Deathworlders had not come to rescue the alien race. They had come to take control, to impose their own will upon a world that had once been free. And as the survivors looked up at the fleet, now settled in the sky like a never-ending storm, they realized the price of their call for help. The storm had answered, but it had answered with power, not mercy. As the human fleet took full control of the alien planet, the survivors could do little but watch as their world was reshaped by the force of the Deathworlders. Cities that had once stood tall, vibrant with life and culture, were now reduced to smoldering ruins. The Earth-like ships moved effortlessly through the smoke and debris, their massive engines thrumming with power. Soldiers in sleek, armored suits marched through the streets, their every step filled with purpose. They weren't here to negotiate or rebuild. They were here to establish control, to make the aliens understand that resistance was not an option. The aliens huddled together in what was left of their shelters, their faces etched with fear and disbelief. They had begged for mercy, for help, and instead, the Deathworlders had come with fire, power, and dominance. It had become clear that the humans had no interest in offering peace. They had come to impose their will upon this world, and there was nothing the aliens could do to stop it. The survivors watched as human soldiers moved into the heart of their cities, setting up bases and laying down their authority. It was not a rescue. It was a takeover. The humans spoke in harsh tones, barking orders at the aliens who had been rounded up. Some of the survivors tried to fight back, but they were crushed under the weight of the humans' superior technology and weaponry. The Deathworlders were unrelenting, and any act of defiance was swiftly met with overwhelming force. As the days passed, the aliens began to see the true nature of the Deathworlders. Their invaders had been cruel, but there had been some understanding, some element of negotiation. The humans, however, were different. They didn't come to compromise or make peace. They came to conquer. Every action they took was calculated, ruthless, and devoid of any compassion. The alien race had never encountered anything like it. The survivors were taken to new camps, separated from their homes, their families, and their past lives. The humans didn't care about their history, their culture, or their hopes. They cared only about control. The camps were surrounded by high walls, guarded by armed Deathworlder soldiers, their faces hidden behind cold visors. Every movement was watched, every word listened to. The once proud alien race had been reduced to prisoners on their own planet. Yet, amidst this crushing reality, a few of the aliens began to hold on to a tiny shred of hope. The humans had arrived with overwhelming power, yes, but they had also brought something else. The soldiers were not just soldiers. They were survivors, too. They were a species that had faced countless battles, survived on worlds far more dangerous than this one, and built their empire on strength. They weren't the gods the aliens had once imagined, but they were a species to be reckoned with. And perhaps, in the dark corners of the camps, a few whispered hopes began to form, hopes that somehow, humanity's unyielding power could offer a chance for survival, even if it came at a cost. The leader of the survivors, an elder with a steady, measured voice, tried to give comfort to those around him. "We asked for mercy," he said softly, "but we called for the storm. We have brought the storm upon ourselves, and now we must learn to endure it." His words, though calming, did little to ease the fear in the eyes of those who had lost everything. The elder himself struggled with the same thoughts, wondering what the future held for them. At the edge of the camps, a line of human soldiers stood, their guns never far from their sides, their gazes cold and unflinching. The Deathworlders, the very beings the aliens had once feared and revered, now held their lives in their hands. And in the distance, the fleet still hovered, an unbroken line of warships watching over the planet. No longer were the aliens the masters of their world. It was the Deathworlders who decided its fate now. As the humans began to establish their authority and implement their control, the survivors of the alien race had no choice but to watch. The once thriving cities that had been their homes were now under the control of a force beyond their comprehension. They had called out for help, but the help they received was not what they had imagined. It was not healing or peace. It was the cold, unyielding power of the Deathworlders, who came to reshape the world in their image. The survivors knew that their world would never be the same again. The question was no longer how to survive, but how to live under the shadow of such overwhelming power. The Deathworlders had come, and they had brought with them a new era, one that would be defined by their strength, their might, and their unbending will. For the aliens, the war had ended, but the real struggle was just beginning. The planet, once filled with life and color, had now become a prison of steel and shadows. The towering human ships had settled above, casting an unyielding shadow over the land. The skies, once clear, now held nothing but the dark silhouettes of the Deathworlders' fleet. The people, once masters of their world, were now little more than subjects, living in camps surrounded by armed soldiers who watched their every move. There was no escape. The Deathworlders had sealed the planet, ensuring that no one could run or hide. They were trapped in their own home, under the iron grip of those who had come to conquer, not save. Inside the camp, the alien survivors tried to adjust to their new reality. There were no longer any dreams of freedom, no thoughts of reclaiming their cities or homes. The once proud alien race now had to survive in the shadow of the humans, their every action controlled, their every word weighed. They were kept in check by the overwhelming power of the Deathworlders. Every day, more soldiers patrolled the perimeter, their weapons drawn and ready. No one dared to make a move. Any act of defiance was met with swift and merciless punishment. The alien leader, the Elder, gathered the survivors together in what little space was left. His voice was quiet, but firm. "We did not ask for this. But it is here now, and we must find a way to endure. The storm has come, and we must learn to live with it." His words gave little comfort. How could they endure such a force? They had once been proud, powerful, and now they were at the mercy of the Deathworlders. In the distance, the human warships continued their endless watch, their silent presence a constant reminder of the fate that had befallen them. The survivors were left wondering what their future would look like. Would they be allowed to live? Would they ever have a chance to rebuild? Or would they remain in the shadow of the Deathworlders forever? As time passed, the Deathworlders began to impose their rules. The alien survivors were given food and water, but it came with a price. They were forced to work, to contribute to the rebuilding of the world they had once known, under the supervision of the soldiers. The humans made sure that every task was carried out with precision, and there was no room for failure. Those who didn't meet the standards were swiftly dealt with. It wasn't just the destruction of their cities that had crushed them. It was the weight of the humans' control that broke their spirit. But even in this grim new reality, there were whispers of resistance. Some of the survivors believed that they could still fight back, that they could find a way to drive the Deathworlders out. But others, more practical, feared that any act of resistance would only bring more destruction. They had seen what the humans were capable of. No one dared to openly challenge them. Among the survivors, there were a few who quietly began to question their fate. Had they made a mistake in calling for help? In their desperation, had they unwittingly invited the storm? The invaders had been ruthless, but they were nothing compared to the cold, calculated power of the Deathworlders. The humans were not just conquerors, they were survivors, too. They had built their empire on strength, and they used that strength without hesitation. The survivor leader, the Elder, saw the fear in the eyes of his people. He knew they were questioning everything. He, too, had doubts. But he held on to one truth. The Deathwelders, though merciless, were a force that could not be ignored. Perhaps they would bring destruction, but perhaps they would also bring an opportunity to survive, to learn, and perhaps, in time, to rise again. But for now, survival was all that mattered. And so, the survivors continued their lives in the shadow of the Deathwelder fleet, waiting, wondering, and praying. But above all, they learned to endure, knowing that the storm was not over yet. The Deathwelders had arrived, and the alien world would never be the same as the days passed. The aliens began to understand the full extent of their situation. The humans, or Deathwelders as they had come to think of them, had not only secured the planet but were now reshaping it in their own image. The once lush landscapes, filled with towering trees and crystal-clear lakes, were being replaced by towering structures of steel and concrete. The humans began constructing military bases and research facilities in the places that had once been bustling cities, transforming the very heart of their civilization into a fortified stronghold. The alien survivors, stripped of their homes and livelihoods, were left with only the remnants of their once vibrant world. Inside the camps, the mood grew darker with each passing day. There was no room for rebellion, no hope of escape. Every move they made, every action they took, was watched by the ever-present eyes of the Deathwelder soldiers. The aliens were forced to work, to assist in the reconstruction of their world, but it was clear that they were being broken, physically and emotionally. The survivors' will to resist slowly eroded, crushed beneath the weight of the human fleet and the constant reminder that they were no longer masters of their own fate. In the center of the camp, the elder stood in front of the others, his face worn and tired, but his eyes still carried the fire of defiance. He had seen too much to give up, too much to let go of the hope that one day, they could find a way to fight back. "We did not ask for this fate," he said to the survivors, his voice steady though tinged with sorrow. "But it is here now, and we must endure. We must keep our strength, even if it feels like it is slipping away." The alien survivors gathered around him, their faces a mix of fear, anger, and confusion. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to fight back against a power so overwhelming. All they had known was a life of peace and prosperity, and now that was gone, replaced with a brutal reality where survival seemed like a distant dream. Above them, the sky was no longer the clear blue it once had been. The human ships hung in the atmosphere like dark clouds, their presence casting a permanent shadow over the planet. The Deathwelders had not only come to conquer but to establish a permanent presence, and they showed no signs of leaving anytime soon. The alien survivors had no idea how long they would be trapped under the watchful eye of their new rulers. The humans, it seemed, had no intention of returning control to the aliens. Their world was now a colony, a world under the rule of the most powerful species in the galaxy. The alien survivors were not free. They were subjects, living under the constant surveillance of the Deathwelders. There was no place for them to run, no place to hide. The humans had the technology, the power, and the will to crush anything that stood in their way. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, something began to shift among the alien survivors. The first spark of rebellion, though small and uncertain, began to flicker in the hearts of some. Not all of the survivors had given up hope. Some of them still believed that there was a way to push back, to reclaim their world from the Deathwelders. They began to secretly organize, to gather information, to plan. It was a dangerous game, one that could cost them everything, but they felt they had nothing left to lose. The elder, sensing the growing unrest, called together a small group of trusted survivors. "We cannot wait for mercy," he told them. Mercy was never a part of their plan. "We have to fight, not for revenge, but for our future. For the future of our people. We have to find a way to regain control, even if it means taking risks." The group was hesitant, afraid of what their actions might bring. But in the silence of their prison-like camps, in the shadow of the ever-watchful Deathwelder soldiers, they realized that they had no other choice. The storm had come, and now it was up to them to decide if they would be swept away or if they would fight back. The humans had come with overwhelming power, but the aliens still had one thing left, their determination. They would not go quietly into the night. The battle for their world was far from over, and the survivors would find a way to fight back, no matter the cost. The Deathwelders had come with their storm, but the aliens would not let it destroy them completely. They would rise again, even if it meant challenging the most dangerous species in the galaxy. And so, in the depths of their despair, in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, the survivors began to make plans, to fight for what was left of their home. They knew it wouldn't be easy. They knew the odds were against them. But they also knew that their world, their people, were worth fighting for. The storm had come, but it was not over yet. The Deathwelders may have had the power, but the aliens still had their spirit, and that was something no army could take away. Days turned into weeks, and the life under the shadow of the Deathwelder fleet became an unrelenting routine. The alien survivors were forced into labor, rebuilding what had been destroyed by both their invaders and the humans. Their world, once filled with vibrant landscapes and proud cities, was now a lifeless husk, a shadow of its former self. Everywhere they looked, there were reminders of their helplessness. The towering human structures that replaced their homes, the soldiers who patrolled every corner, the sky darkened by the endless ships overhead. It felt like a constant reminder that they were no longer in control, that their fate was no longer their own. Yet even in the face of this unyielding oppression, the rebellion began to grow. It started quietly, with only a few whispers here and there, as alien survivors secretly met in hidden corners of the camps, exchanging plans, ideas, and hope. These were dangerous acts. Anyone caught conspiring against the Deathwelders would be swiftly punished. But the desire for freedom, for the chance to take back their world, pushed them forward, even when the risk seemed insurmountable. The Elder, still the leader among them, quietly gathered those who were willing to fight. They met in secret, planning what little they could without drawing the attention of the ever-watchful soldiers. The humans, despite their overwhelming presence, were not omnipotent. There were cracks, small weaknesses that the aliens could exploit. And so they began to gather information, studying the Deathwelders' routines, their movements, their technology. Every bit of knowledge they gained, no matter how small, was a victory. The rebellion, though still fragile, had found its first sign of hope. A few alien survivors had managed to steal weapons, small, hidden, and crude, but weapons nonetheless. The humans, in their overconfidence, had underestimated their prisoners, thinking them too broken to fight back. But as the first stolen weapon passed into the hands of a survivor, the sense of possibility grew stronger. In the darkest hours of the night, the rebellion's leaders gathered, their eyes full of defiance. "This is not the life we were meant to live," the Elder said quietly, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped them all. "They came to dominate, to break us. But they do not understand what it means to be broken. We will rise. We will reclaim what is ours." The others nodded, their faces resolute, but the fear still lingered in their eyes. They knew the cost of defiance. They knew what would happen if they failed. The Deathwelders were merciless, and their technology was far beyond anything the aliens had ever seen. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, they had no choice. To survive meant to fight, even if it seemed like a hopeless cause. In the days that followed, the rebellion began to take shape. The alien survivors knew they had no chance of defeating the humans in a head-on battle, but they could strike at the cracks, undermine the control the Deathwelders had over them. They launched small attacks, sabotaging human supplies, disrupting their communications, and weakening their hold on the planet, bit by bit. The Deathwelders, while powerful, were not invincible. They were spread thin, and every small act of resistance made them question if their control over the planet was as complete as they believed. The humans, however, were quick to respond. Their retaliation was swift and brutal. They cracked down on any signs of rebellion, punishing those who dared to defy them. The survivors knew that the humans would not tolerate disobedience, that the price of failure would be high. But despite the brutal consequences, the rebellion continued to grow. With every strike, with every act of defiance, the spirit of the alien race was reignited. One night, as the rebellion's leaders gathered once again in their secret meeting place, the Elder spoke, his voice low but filled with determination. "This is our world. We will fight for it. We will rise from the ashes, no matter how many times we are knocked down. The Deathwelders may have come to conquer, but we will not let them erase us. The plan was set into motion. The rebellion's first major act of defiance was about to begin. They would strike at the heart of the Deathwelders' control, a place where the humans' hold was weakest. It was a dangerous mission, one that could cost them everything, but it was their only chance. The alien survivors, their faces filled with fear but also a new sense of purpose, prepared for the fight of their lives. As the ships above continued their endless watch, the survivors readied themselves for the unknown. The Deathwelders had come with power, but they had underestimated the resilience of the alien race. The storm had come, yes, but it had also ignited something within the survivors, a spark that could never be extinguished. They would rise, not just for survival, but for their free. The night before their planned strike, the camp was unnaturally quiet. It wasn't the usual silence that came from fear of the Deathwelder soldiers. This was different. It was the quiet before a storm, a quiet that carried the weight of something dangerous about to unfold. The alien survivors, gathered in small groups, exchanged nervous but determined glances. They knew what they were about to do could change everything. They were no longer simply fighting to survive. They were fighting for their world, their future. The elder stood at the front, his face stern and resolute. He had been the one to unite them, to remind them of their strength when all seemed lost. But tonight, even his steady hands betrayed a slight tremor. "Tomorrow, we take back what is ours," he said, his voice low and steady. "We may not win, but we will not go quietly. The Deathwelders came here to conquer, but they will leave knowing they were not the only ones who could fight." His words were met with silence, but not the kind of silence born from fear. This was the silence of those who had decided. The rebellion was no longer just a faint hope. It was their reality. Every small act of resistance, every whisper of defiance, had led to this moment. Tomorrow, they would face the might of the Deathwelder fleet, but they would do it on their terms. In the days since the first stolen weapons had been smuggled into the hands of the survivors, they had slowly begun to build a network. They knew their strengths and weaknesses. They knew the terrain. They had watched, studied, and waited for the perfect opportunity to strike. The Deathwelders, despite their overwhelming power, had failed to account for one thing: the resilience of those they sought to control. The plan was simple: hit them where it hurt the most. The Deathwelders had set up their control center in the center of what was once the capital city, a place where their communications, weaponry, and authority all converged. It was heavily guarded, surrounded by walls, watchtowers, and soldiers, but it was also the one place where the Deathwelders were most vulnerable. Their arrogance had made them careless. They thought their control was absolute, but they had underestimated the strength of those they had subjugated. The rebels would strike at dawn, hitting the heart of the Deathwelders' operation. It was a risky move, but it was the only one they had. If they succeeded, they could disrupt the Deathwelders' hold, even if just for a moment. If they failed, they knew they would pay the price, but at least they would have fought. The leader of the rebellion, a fierce young alien who had once been a warrior in her own right, went over the plan one final time with her small group. She had seen the horrors of the Deathwelders firsthand, had witnessed their brutality, and now she had nothing left to lose. Her hands shook slightly as she touched the hilt of the stolen weapon. "This is not just about us," she said quietly. "This is for our children, our ancestors, our future. We may not win, but they will remember that we fought. They will remember that we did not bow." The group nodded in silence, understanding the weight of her words. They were about to walk into the very heart of the enemy's power, but they would do so with their heads held high. They would not let the Deathwelders erase their identity, their history, or their people. At dawn, the world shifted. The alien survivors, armed and ready, moved swiftly through the shadows, using the knowledge they had gained over weeks of watching and waiting. They struck with precision, hitting key targets that would cripple the Deathwelders' infrastructure. Explosions echoed in the distance as communication towers were taken down, and energy grids were disrupted. The rebels moved with the speed and efficiency of hunters, and the Deathwelders, caught off guard, were forced to react. The fighting was intense. The Deathwelders, despite their technological superiority, were not invincible. Their soldiers, though powerful and skilled, were taken by surprise and struggled to regain control. The rebels, fueled by desperation and a fierce will to survive, fought with everything they had. They knew the stakes. They knew they could die, but they also knew they had to make a stand. As the battle raged on, the Elder and the rest of the survivors remained in the shadows, watching the outcome unfold. They had given everything to this cause, and now they could only hope that their comrades would succeed. The explosions grew louder, and the sound of battle filled the air. For the first time in a long while, the alien survivors felt a flicker of hope. The Deathwelders, despite their strength, had underestimated the resolve of those they sought to control. But even as they fought, they knew that this would not be the end. The Deathwelders would retaliate, and the war for their world was far from over. The rebellion had only just begun, and though they had taken the first step, the road ahead would be filled with even greater challenges. As the sun set on the battlefield, the survivors regrouped, battered but not broken. They had struck a blow, but the war was far from won. The Deathwelders had felt the sting of their defiance, and though they would come back stronger, the aliens knew they had planted a seed. The storm had arrived, but the rebellion was not over yet. The Deathwelders would learn that the alien race would never go quietly into the night. No matter what happened, they had shown the galaxy that even the smallest species could stand tall against the mightiest of foes. The battle had left the air thick with smoke and the ground littered with the debris of shattered hopes. The initial surprise of the attack had worn off, but the Deathwelders' response was swift and brutal. The surviving rebels, though bruised and weary, had given everything they could, but the human forces were too vast, too prepared. The explosions had been deafening, and the Resistance's small victories felt insignificant against the tide of destruction that followed. The rebels who managed to escape the counterattack fled back into the shadows, nursing wounds both physical and emotional. The world that had once been their home, their pride, was now a battlefield. But they had made their mark. For the first time, the Deathwelders had seen that the aliens were not just submissive beings waiting to be controlled. The rebellion had shaken their confidence. The humans had not expected the resistance to be so organized, so determined. As the survivors regrouped in the dark corners of their hideouts, the reality of their situation began to settle in. They had struck a blow, yes, but the cost had been high. The Deathwelders had retaliated with unrelenting force, crushing much of the rebellion's infrastructure. But there was still a flicker of hope among the survivors. They had stood against the human might, and they had shown that they could disrupt the Deathwelders' grip on their world. The Elder, weary but resolute, addressed the group that had gathered in the makeshift camp. The lines on his face were deep, carved by loss and the weight of leadership. "We knew this would not be easy," he said, his voice low but steady. "But we have made them see us. The storm has not passed. It has only just begun. Our fight is far from over." The survivors, though exhausted, nodded in agreement. They had seen the full power of the Deathwelders. They knew that the humans would not back down easily, but they also knew that they could not stop fighting. They could not let their world fall into complete destruction. They would not let the Deathwelders turn it into a colony of shadows. The rebellion had lost ground, but it had not lost heart. The survivors began to plan again, quietly, cautiously, knowing that every move they made was watched by the ever-present human soldiers. The Deathwelders had not crushed them completely, and as long as they were alive, there was still a chance. It was a slim chance, but it was enough to fuel their will to fight. In the distance, the human warships continued to patrol the skies, their looming presence a constant reminder of their dominance. Yet, even as they surveyed the wreckage, the humans could not erase the truth that had been planted in their minds, that the aliens, though small and weak, had the strength to resist. And though the Deathwelders would undoubtedly regroup and press forward, the aliens knew that they had gained something more important than just temporary victories. They had gained hope. As the survivors gathered resources and regrouped, there was a new sense of purpose. They had learned from their mistakes, adapted to the human strategies, and had begun to find new ways to strike at the Deathwelders. Every small victory, Every act of sabotage, every instance where they disrupted the human occupation was another reminder that the storm had not defeated them. It had only strengthened their resolve. The elder once again stood at the front, looking at the survivors who had gathered around him. They had all been through so much, but they were still here. "We will rise again," he said quietly. "We have shown them that we are not weak. The Deathwelders will not have this planet without a fight. We will fight until our last breath." The survivors nodded in silent agreement. They had lost much, but they had not lost everything. As long as there was breath in their bodies, they would resist. They would fight for their world, for their people, for their future. And in their hearts, they knew one thing above all else. They would not let the Deathwelders erase them. The quiet that followed the battle was deafening, but it was a different kind of silence now. The survivors had learned the hard way that the Deathwelders' might was unyielding, but the spark of resistance had not been fully snuffed out. It flickered, fragile but alive. The alien survivors regrouped in hidden corners of their devastated world, their bodies bruised and broken, but their spirits undeterred. They had struck at the heart of the Deathwelders' control, and though the humans had retaliated with overwhelming force, they had seen the cracks in the human armor, the weaknesses in their plans. The rebel leader, a fierce and determined alien woman, surveyed the remnants of the rebellion's efforts. Their plans had been thwarted, many had fallen, but those who were left were still standing, still willing to fight. "This is not the end," she whispered to herself. "This is only the beginning." She stood tall, her expression filled with the weight of everything they had lost, but also with the resolve to keep pushing forward. The death toll had been high. The rebel cells that had scattered after the failed attack were now in hiding, licking their wounds and regrouping. But despite the losses, despite the overwhelming strength of the Deathwelders, the survivors had made the humans bleed. The rebel leader knew that even the Deathwelders could not ignore that. The invasion had been swift, brutal, and decisive, but it was not unchallenged. Around the makeshift campfires, the remaining survivors whispered of their next steps. They spoke of the weaknesses they had learned from their first assault. They had discovered that the Deathwelders, though fierce and powerful, were not omnipotent. They could be caught off guard. They could be stretched thin. There was still hope, though it was a fragile hope, one that needed to be nurtured carefully. The rebel leader knew that in order to have any chance of defeating the Deathwelders, they would need more than just guerrilla tactics. They needed allies. But the question was, who could they turn to? The rest of the galaxy had already seen their call for help, and no one had come to their aid. The Deathwelders were the most feared species in the galaxy, and no one wanted to risk drawing their attention. The alien survivors were alone in their fight. Yet there was a growing determination among them. They had seen their planet ripped apart, but they had also seen what they were capable of. The rebellion had started with small acts of defiance, but it had evolved into something more. The humans may have the firepower, but the aliens had something just as powerful: their will to survive, to protect their home. At night, under the cover of darkness, the rebel cells began to move again. They raided supply depots, destroyed communication lines, and sabotaged key infrastructure. Every act of resistance, no matter how small, was a victory. They were chipping away at the Deathwelders' control, proving that they were not defeated. They would never be defeated. The Deathwelders responded with their usual brutality. The human forces cracked down harder than before, hunting down the rebels with a precision that made the alien survivors' hearts race in fear. But even under the threat of total annihilation, they did not falter. The human soldiers might have been ruthless, but they were not invincible. The aliens learned how to outsmart them, how to slip through their fingers when the humans thought they had them cornered. The rebel leader spent her days organizing the survivors, training them, teaching them the tactics they had learned in their early skirmishes. She knew that they would need every advantage they could get. The Deathwelders had strength, but the aliens had ingenuity. They had to play to their strengths, to fight smarter, not harder. As the days turned into weeks, the aliens slowly began to build a network of resistance. They were careful, moving in the shadows, always one step ahead of the Deathwelders. Every act of sabotage, every whisper of rebellion, was another crack in the Deathwelders' foundation. They were winning the small battles, but the real war had yet to begin. The rebel leader stood at the edge of a crumbled city, looking out at the vast fleet of human warships that hovered above, their presence still a constant reminder of their oppression. "We will fight," she whispered to herself, her voice strong despite the fear that gripped her heart. "We will fight until the very last of us stands. We will not let them erase us." The resistance was small, but it was growing. The rebellion had sparked something within the alien survivors. A fire that would not be extinguished, no matter how many times the Deathworlders tried to crush it. The battle for their planet was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, the survivors dared to believe that victory might still be within their reach. It would be a long, hard road, but they would walk it together. And as long as they had breath in their bodies, they would never stop fighting. As the days stretched on, the rebel forces grew bolder, their attacks more calculated. The alien survivors, despite the odds stacked against them, found ways to strike at the heart of the Deathworlders' occupation. Each small victory, though fleeting, fueled their resolve. They hit the human forces where it hurt: supply lines, power grids, and communication hubs. The Deathworlders were quick to respond, but the aliens were learning, adapting, and growing more sophisticated in their tactics. In the midst of the rebellion, the Elder continued to serve as a beacon of hope, though his own hope was wearing thin. He had seen too many of his people fall, too many sacrifices made in the name of survival. But still, he led, his voice calm and steady when the survivors gathered around him. "We are not defeated," he said, though his eyes betrayed the toll the war had taken on him. "Every act of resistance, every day we stand against them, is a victory. We may not have the power they possess, but we have something far stronger: our will to survive." The rebel leader, a fierce woman who had once been a warrior, stood beside him. She had seen the same losses, felt the same fear, but there was a fire in her eyes that refused to die. "We will continue to fight," she declared, her voice cutting through the heavy air. "They may have destroyed our homes, but they have not taken our spirit. As long as we breathe, we will rise again." The survivors, bruised and blooded, nodded in agreement. Their numbers were smaller now, but their resolve was unshaken. The Deathworlders had expected them to crumble, to beg for mercy, but they had been wrong. The rebellion had only grown stronger, more organized, and now they had a new weapon: unity. The survivors had come together in ways they had never imagined, forming bonds that were unbreakable. They shared their knowledge, their resources, and their hope. It was this bond that made them dangerous. The Deathworlders, though powerful, were not invincible. Their arrogance had made them blind to the strength of the alien race they had sought to conquer. The humans had underestimated the aliens' ability to adapt, to resist, and to fight back. Now, the rebellion was more than just a thorn in the side of the Deathworlders. It was a force that could not be ignored. As the weeks passed, the human forces began to feel the pressure. The rebellion's strikes were becoming more frequent, more coordinated, and more effective. The Deathworlders, despite their overwhelming military power, found themselves stretched thin, their resources drained, their soldiers exhausted. The humans had underestimated the alien race's resilience, and now they were paying the price. One day, as the survivors prepared for another attack, the rebel leader gathered them around, her face serious. "We have been striking at their foundations," she said. "But now, we go straight for the heart. The time has come to make our move." The elder nodded in agreement, his eyes hardening with determination. "We will strike at the core of their operations," he said. "It will be a risky move, but it's the only chance we have left. If we succeed, we can cripple their entire occupation." The plan was bold, perhaps even foolish, but the survivors had no other choice. They would launch a final, all-out assault on the heart of the Deathworlders' control center. The location was heavily guarded, surrounded by layers of defenses, but the rebellion had learned to move in the shadows. They had a small but highly trained force, and if they could get inside, they could strike a blow that would cripple the Deathworlders' hold on their planet. The mission was set into motion. The survivors moved quickly, their eyes set on the target. They fought their way through the streets, using every tactic they had learned in their previous battles. Explosions rocked the city, sending shockwaves through the human defenses. The soldiers, though highly trained, struggled to keep up with the guerrilla tactics of the rebels. The humans were powerful, but they were not prepared for the sheer ferocity of the alien resistance. As the rebels closed in on the heart of the human stronghold, they knew this would be their greatest challenge. They had lost too much, and yet they were still fighting. They were fighting for their planet, for their people, and for the future. The Deathwelders had come to conquer, but the alien survivors were proving that they would not go quietly into the night. The final battle was chaos. The sound of gunfire, the roar of engines, and the cries of the wounded filled the air. The Deathwelders fought with everything they had, but the rebels were relentless. They pushed forward, their weapons drawn, their hearts set on one goal, victory. The human forces, though strong, began to buckle under the pressure. The rebellion had finally broken through their defenses, and now, as the Deathwelders retreated, the survivors had a chance to strike at the heart of the human occupation. The battle raged on, but the tide was turning. The Deathwelders, though powerful, were finally realizing that the alien race they had tried to destroy was not as weak as they had believed. And as the dust settled and the last of the Deathwelder forces retreated, the alien survivors stood victorious. The planet had been saved, but the war was far from over. The Deathwelders would return, of that, they were certain. But for now, the survivors knew that they had won a crucial battle. The rebellion had proven that even the most powerful species could be resisted. It was a victory, yes, but it was only the beginning. The storm had come, but the fight for their world was far from over. The rebel survivors stood in the silence that followed the battle, their chests heaving with exhaustion, but their faces set with determination. The Deathwelder fleet had been forced to retreat, but the victory felt bittersweet. The planet they had fought so hard to protect was still scarred, and their homes, once thriving with life and culture, were reduced to rubble. Yet, despite the heavy cost, they had achieved something that once seemed impossible. They had fought back. They had made the Deathwelders bleed, and they had shown the universe that even the most dominant force in the galaxy could be challenged. The Elder, though weary, stood among them, his eyes scanning the remnants of the battlefield. The skies, once darkened by the presence of the human fleet, were now quiet, though the distant hum of their ships still echoed in the air. The victory was theirs, but it was a fragile one. The Deathwelders would not be gone for long. It was only a matter of time before they regrouped, before they returned with a vengeance. But the Elder knew something had shifted today. The spark of resistance had grown into a fire, and no matter how many times the humans came, the rebellion would not be extinguished. "We have won today," the Elder said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "But the war is not over. The Deathwelders will return, and they will not forget what we have done. But neither will we. We will fight again, and again, until they understand that we are not to be conquered. We are a people that will never give up." The survivors gathered around him, their faces reflecting the same resolve. They had seen what the Deathwelders were capable of, but they had also seen their own strength. They had fought for their planet, their homes, and their people, and they had won. The humans might have more ships, more weapons, more soldiers, but the aliens had something they couldn't take away: their will to survive. In the days that followed, the survivors began the slow process of rebuilding. The destruction was vast, and the task before them seemed insurmountable. But they worked together, each day a small step toward recovery. They knew that the Deathwelders would return, that the fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, they dared to hope. They had shown the Deathwelders that they were not weak, that they would not be crushed under the weight of their might. The rebellion had proven one thing: even the most powerful forces could be resisted. The Deathwelders had come with fire and power, but they had not counted on the strength of those they sought to dominate. The battle for their world was not over, but the aliens knew that they would never face it alone. They had each other. They had the spirit of their people, and they had a future worth fighting for. And so, as the rebuilding began and the survivors looked out across the wreckage of their world, they understood one thing: this was only the beginning. The Deathwelders had come with an army, but the aliens had come with something stronger: the will to fight for their future, no matter the cost. The storm had come, but the aliens had shown that they could weather it. They had taken back what was theirs, and they would continue to fight for their planet, their freedom, and their survival. The Deathworlders had learned that the aliens were not a race to be conquered. They were a race that would rise again, again, and again, until the storm was no longer a threat but a distant memory. And as the alien survivors stood together, watching the horizon where the Deathworlders' ships had once loomed, they knew one thing. The fight was far from over, but as long as they stood together, they would never fall.